Hello, Micah Keel here again to talk with you I think will be a relatively short presentation, this one. Um, just kind of talking about some of the broad contours of the book of Deuteronomy, and then the set of texts that are sometimes referred to as the former prophets. These refer to the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. The book of Ruth is stuck in there as well, right before the story of David begins, but that book seems to have come from a different time and place. When we look at these texts, the former prophets is just one way that 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings sometimes gets referred to. These are sometimes also called the Deuteronomistic history. We'll talk about where that term comes from. But we're talking here about texts that broadly tell the story of the time when the people have lived in the land that was promised to Abraham. First, during the period of Judges, which is covered by the books Joshua and Judges, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel talks mostly about the reigns of Saul and then David and Solomon, and then 1st and 2nd Kings mostly tells the story of the divided kingdoms up to the two destructions by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. I'm going to point out a couple of things and some things to watch for and think about when you're reading this literature. Before we can understand any of that, though, we need to actually stop and consider the book of Deuteronomy itself. The word Deuteronomy means second law, and that's in some cases really what the book of Deuteronomy is. It's a retelling or a recapitulation of the Jewish law. It's set, it's really not much of a narrative, but the narrative setting for the book of Deuteronomy is that the people are right on the cusp of entering the promised land. They have been wandering in the desert for 40 years. Moses has been their leader. And this is a retelling of the law that is meant to sort of be conditional and a basis for their entrance into the land. So some people refer to this as a theological telling of the law in a liminal place, being right on the edge between two things. You're right on the cusp of entering the promised land. Now it's interesting, there's a story in the book of 2 Kings chapter 22 that some scholars have connected with the origins of the book of Deuteronomy. And in the story in 2 Kings, you can pause and read that if you'd like. But essentially, they're doing some work in the temple, and they find a book of the law that was hidden in the temple. And when the king reads this book of the law, he tears his clothes and he suddenly realizes all the mistakes that they've made. And what you'll find when you read Deuteronomy is that it is a highly sort of conditional understanding of the covenant. And so Deuteronomy seems perhaps to have been written after the experience of being destroyed either by Assyria or Babylon, and written sort of retrospectively after that experience in an attempt to try to understand what went wrong, what did we do or not do that caused God to abandon us and allow us to be destroyed by our enemies in this way. So the way that Deuteronomy formulates the law offers what you might call a theology of history, or a theological history. It's trying to establish the law in such a way so that it can explain the experiences of the people. This perspective of Deuteronomy, which we're going to look at more closely in a second, we think then was also a perspective used to edit and organize all of the material in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So that's why we call these texts the Deuteronomistic history, because they may have taken legendary or court tales or even real historical information about the kings and sort of edited it or recast it in a way so that it comes into alignment with the perspective of Deuteronomy, so that the things that happen intentionally cohere with and teach the lessons that the book of Deuteronomy wants people to learn. I think this will make more sense when we start looking at the specifics. Some key texts in Deuteronomy to focus on, and you could pause after each one of these if you want. But in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 1 through 9, we get the famous Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. I'm flipping there now. The great commandment. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, or the Lord is one, depending on how you translate that. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Keep these words that I am commanding you today in your heart. Recite them to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you rise. Very famous text, key to the heart of what the book of Deuteronomy is all about. In chapter 28, verses 1 and 2, and verse 15, we get a little clearer sense, I think, of sort of the ideology that lies behind the book of Deuteronomy. So listen to the first two verses of chapter 28. If you will only obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments that I am commanding you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the Lord your God. So in other words, if you do this, you will get this. If you do X, you will get Y. If you jump down to verse 15, you get the opposite. But if you will not obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments and decrees, which I am commanding you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And you can keep reading if you want to hear about all the curses. So this is kind of the core of the perspective we see in the book of Deuteronomy, that if you do the right thing, God will bless you. If you do the wrong thing, God will curse you. Deuteronomy seems to have no problem thinking that people can make the right choices. If you look at chapter 30, verse 11, surely this commandment that I am commanding you today is not too hard for you, nor is it too far away. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us and get it for us so that we may hear it and observe it? Neither is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross to the other side of the sea for us and get it for us so that we may hear it and observe it? No. The word is very near to you. It is in your mouth and in your heart for you to observe. If you jump down toward the end of this section, sorry, I lost my spot. Anyway, later he says, today I have set before you life and death. Choose life. There it is, verse 19. I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live. So here is the core of the Deuteronomistic perspective. It's quite formulaic in a sense. If you obey, God will bless. If you disobey, God will curse or punish. This is what we call the Deuteronomistic perspective. I think if you stop and think about this, it doesn't take a lot of thinking to think about the ways in which this perspective just doesn't really work out in reality. And there are plenty of texts that we'll study in other parts of this course that intentionally seem to want to contradict what Deuteronomy says. We'll read the book of Ecclesiastes, perhaps the book of Job. There are other places as well. So it's a particular theological formulation, but it's not the only one in the Old Testament. And we'll look at those others at another point in time. If you look at the books of Joshua and Judges, The book of Joshua tells the stories of conquest, for example, the story of Jericho. Interesting stories here, a lot of problematic stories in the terms of the kind of violence that God commands Joshua and the Israelites to hand out to other people. The book of Judges has some really interesting stories. We'll maybe look when we're together at the stories in chapters 4 and 5 of Jael and Heber and Deborah. Really an interesting, fascinating tale. If you look at the book of Judges, it's interesting. You can get a clear sense of the so-called Deuteronomistic perspective in the way these stories are framed. So, for instance, in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, it says this, "Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you into the land that I had promised to your ancestors. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. For your part, do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. Tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my command. See what you have done. So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become adversaries to you, and their gods shall be a snare to you." So in other words, they did the wrong thing, and they bore the punishment for that. If you look in chapter 2, verse 11, it says, "Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and worshipped the Baals, and they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were all around them and bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger." If you look at chapter 3, verse 7, "The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God and worshiping the Baals and the Asherahs. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim." If you look at chapter 3, verse 12, "The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord." Look at chapter 4, verse 1. "The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord." So anyway, I think you catch the point. The point is, all of these stories are introduced with this sort of homage to the Deuteronomistic point of view, that the people had done something wrong, and God therefore raised up some sort of adversary or consequence for them as a result. These are the kinds of things that suggest to us that the person responsible for the final form of the books of Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel through 2 Kings, we're working from a perspective that fit pretty closely with what you find in Deuteronomy. If we move beyond Joshua and Judges, when you come to the book of 1 Samuel, you start to see that the people want a king. God isn't really happy about this because God wants to be their king, but God eventually relents. If you want to take a minute and just read Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20 and 1 Samuel 8, 10 through 18, you can. It's kind of an interesting exercise to see the different ways that these two books talk about the king. Deuteronomy has a very highly idealistic view of the king, and lays out kind of almost a misty-eyed view that wouldn't really have much basis in reality. I mean, these are things that were certainly important to them. If you read the version in 1 Samuel, it's kind of the realistic side of what having a king meant. He's going to conscript sons and daughters. He's going to impose taxes of your fields, wine, and grain. Essentially, the people will become his slaves. 1 Samuel has sort of the realistic point of view. Deuteronomy has kind of the pie in the sky, idealistic view of what it would like to have what it would be like to have a king. The kingship in 1 and 2 Samuel also is interesting. This all begins with God raising up Samuel the prophet. His origin here starts with his birth from Hannah. And Hannah is one who could not have children, but then eventually she does, and she sings a wonderful song in praise to God, a hymn that clearly the Gospel of Luke patterns its Song of Mary on the Song of Hannah. Saul is the first king anointed and chosen, but this doesn't go very well. 1535, God is sorry or seems to regret ever having made Saul king. Saul does an unlawful sacrifice and a bunch of other things. It just doesn't turn out well. But then eventually David is anointed king. The people love him. He expands their territory, etc. If we talk about the reign of David, we enter really into the realm of history in a way that we don't at any point earlier in the Hebrew Bible. I think I've said earlier, the events in the Pentateuch, there's really never any corroborating historical evidence. It's not to say that they didn't happen, but the Exodus, for example, other stories in the Pentateuch, we don't have any evidence that any of that, any archaeological evidence to support any of those stories. Same is generally true for the book of Joshua. But when we get into 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, we do start to have archaeological data. This picture on the right hand of the screen is called the Tel Dan inscription. And this refers to the house of David. So it's hard evidence of a king named David that I think most scholars take fairly seriously. Now, the depiction of David's victories and his kingdom, particularly Solomon's kingdom as well, probably exaggerated, probably not 100% historically accurate. But when we're trying to understand what genre of literature we're reading, when we read these texts, we have left the genre of myth. These are not myths. These are maybe more, you might call them legends. They're sort of quasi-historical narratives. They certainly have some mythological elements, but it's a different kind of literature that we are reading in these texts. David seems to be a smart ruler. He knows that there's tension among the 12 tribes. So he centralizes the cult in Jerusalem, which is sort of right on the border between the north and the south. It's not that different in some ways from the decision made in the early United States to put the capital in Washington, D.C., which was right on the border between the north and the south. David has many great military victories, but he also has his dark side. There's the really troubling episode where he rapes Bathsheba, and that leads to a whole host of sort of negative consequences for him and Bathsheba and her family. Obviously, David has her husband killed in the process, so it's not a good look at that point. But God does allow David to be forgiven. David is contrite and asks for forgiveness after this terrible episode. Eventually, the first child that David and Bathsheba have, God kills it as a punishment. But then they have another child who is Solomon. And Bathsheba sort of corners David at some point and says, it needs to be our child, because David has children with all sorts of women. It needs to be our child, Bathsheba says, who will inherit your kingdom. And that indeed is what David allows to happen. So that child is Solomon. Solomon is known for his wisdom. If you look at 1 Kings chapter 3, he's known for his the opulence and wealth of his kingdom, the famous story of him being visited by the Queen of Sheba. Sort of stories that are meant to kind of put Israel on the international stage in a sense. But Solomon too also has his problems. In 1 Kings 11, it talks about how Solomon loves women, and especially foreign women, and they cause his heart to turn away from God and to worship their other deities. God says that because of the promise he made to his father David, he will not take the kingdom away from Solomon while Solomon is alive. But the consequence for not staying true to the covenant for Solomon is that the kingdom will be torn from him. And that's indeed what happens. When Solomon dies, the northern 10 tribes secede, and they break off and become the northern kingdom called Israel. This kingdom eventually is destroyed by the Assyrians in 722. Then the southern kingdom destroys the south in 587. So most of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings tell the parallel stories of these two kings, the kings in the north, the kings in the south. There are various prophets that show up throughout this time. That's why these texts are referred to as the former prophets, whereas the latter prophets are those texts that come from the prophets themselves, like Isaiah or Micah or Jeremiah. These stories continue to have this deuteronomistic perspective. There's a lot of great famous literature and stories throughout these texts. We're not going to have time to get into a lot of them real specifically, but hopefully these words at least give some kind of framing, some kind of perspective to keep track of. I would encourage you, a lot of times in the lectionary, you'll see sort of a series of stories that show up. So right now, in the daily lectionary, we've sort of been following the story of David and Saul and their rivalry in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And if you're ever tasked with preaching on these, I'd encourage you to maybe check in with the textbook and just learn a little bit more about them. There'll be nice chapters on those chapters in those books. And also to think about them not just as historical stories, but as an author at some point trying to make other theological points in these texts as well. So thanks for watching this. I will also start a chat room board. Maybe I'll put a leading question on there, but also curious if you have any questions or comments or follow-up to these slides. Thank you.